Alrighty. So welcome to the folks who are joining us online, watching this recording after the session. We're so grateful for the folks who are able to be here today, for the folks who tune in after we're done. Particularly grateful for our guest, Ryan. So for folks who don't know, my name is Jeff. I use they, he pronouns. I'm the co-executive director here at How's Our Neighbors. We are going to be talking about wealth inequality today and how it impacts housing. First, I wanted to give Ryan a second to introduce himself. Ryan is with the Economic Opportunity Institute. So that's rather really cool things. So I wanted to share and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I have attended some of these before, and so it's really nice to be here. And hi to everyone who's here. I'm Ryan. As Jeff said, I'm the executive director at the Economic Opportunity Institute, or EOI. We're a progressive think tank based in Seattle, been around since 1998, and primarily work in Olympia on tax and budget. So we were one of the major groups behind the millionaire's tax this last legislative session. We work on healthcare, trying to lower healthcare prices, and we work on paid leave and childcare. We were one of the groups that helped get paid family medical leave passed. Prior to joining EOI, I was very involved with the Urbanists for a number of years, both running their C4 endorsements, serving on the board, and then being the part-time executive director for a little while. And I've also spent about 10 years working in housing homelessness in a bunch of different capacities, mostly outside of Seattle. So really excited to be here. And I also wanted to mention, because there's a relatively small number of us here, if you're willing to just like drop a little bit about who you are in the chat, it would help me just understand who I'm talking to and make sure I'm not saying things that you will already know. If you don't want to and just want to listen, that's fine too.
Yeah, no, thanks for that invitation, Ryan. Yeah, please, if folks are comfortable in the chat, you can put, we can obviously see your name, pronouns, if you have any affiliation, what drew you to this conversation today, anything like that that you'd want to share. Maybe if you've been to a HAN event before, or if you just heard about this for the first time, I think I recognize most of the names here. But yeah, I'd love to know who's in the room. Um, as folks are doing that, I just kind of wanted to ground us in this discussion a little bit. Um, so I feel like wealth inequality is something that has been part of our national political conversation more and more lately, and as well as here in our state context and in our local context. We are seeing record numbers of wealth inequality, record amounts of wealth inequality. I think a lot of people on this call probably saw that we have the world's first trillionaire. And we're hearing a lot of discussion. Well, so glad that folks are introducing themselves in the chat. Um, yeah, a lot of discussion about what kind of impacts that's having on our society. I feel like we often hear a lot about wealth inequality in the context of like what we can do at what our government can do, what impact it has on folks' ability to accrue wealth themselves. Um, uh, and we really wanted to have this conversation kind of in a local context. And of course, How's Our Neighbors, we wanted to talk about this as it relates to housing. Yeah, in the context here in Washington, Washington, as you all might know, has a very regressive tax code. And we've been thinking a lot about how we have very large wealth inequality in our state. We have some very wealthy companies, wealthy individuals who live here. And yet we have a tax code that doesn't like ask those folks to pay their fair share and do something about kind of reducing that inequality. Our tax code instead kind of bakes it in. And that has led to a series of initiatives to try to balance our tax code, most notably in most recent legislative session, as Ryan mentioned, with the passage of a millionaire's tax, which is very exciting. But there's obviously a lot more work to be done here, a lot more to discuss. And we really want to, so first, we want to kind of ground ourselves in what are we talking about when we're talking about wealth inequality? What do we mean? And then we'll talk about it as it relates to our housing and the stuff that we work on here at House Our Neighbors. So I'm going to kick off this discussion by asking a question to Ryan that we're going to kind of get into, and then the conversation is going to kind of go from there. Again, we're a pretty small group, so if folks want to interject, if you've got something that you want to kind of jump off of what either Ryan or I say, feel free to like jump in the chat, or if you really want to pop in, just go ahead and raise your hand. welcome to join on in. And we'll have a fun little discussion. So, Ryan, my first question for you is really kind of wanting you to set the stage for us. Um, what do we mean when we're talking about wealth inequality? We hear it talked about a lot, but what do we really mean about that? What is wealth? Who owns the wealth of our country? And maybe more important for this conversation, who doesn't?
Totally. I was really thrilled when I knew we were going to be talking about this because back in grad school, I got to take a bunch of classes on the history of economics. And because I'm a huge nerd, I love those classes. And this kind of gets back to the history of economics because uh, when economists started to try to figure out like what makes the economy work, what are the factors of production, is what they're called. They, since the beginning, really have come up with three answers. There's sort of a borderline argument for a fourth that's come out now. And the three things are land, labor, and capital. Land is obvious. That's what's all around us. Labor is the work you do, and capital is stuff. Physical stuff sometimes, but increasingly financial stuff, stuff you own. Uh, and in really early economies, land was by far the most important thing to own if you wanted to build wealth. That's why you see huge wars being fought all the way over human history over land. Um, but increasingly, as we got closer to the Industrial Revolution and into the Industrial Revolution, labor became much more interesting and important to economists because labor was increasingly something you didn't just do for yourself, like making the food for your dinner and your family's dinner. It was something you sold. And so there was a concept called returns to labor. And you could make money by selling your labor to other folks. Um, and so labor became a subject of real interest to economists. And since the Industrial Revolution, and increasingly so, the thing that has been driving the most wealth building is returns to capital. So you own something and you turn that into more money over time. And so wealth basically is the accumulated result of high returns to capital. Like you own something, you use that something to turn into more money, and then you increasingly have more money over time. And I know that's all kind of wonky and technical, but I think it's really important because one of the really important differences between capital versus labor or land is that it is much easier to get capital if you already have some of it. And I think people understand this intuitively. Like if you're already rich, it's much easier to get more rich than it is to get rich if you're poor. Um, but this is a really important thing to understand politically because that fact that capital grows disproportionately to how much you have it means that it is structurally increasingly unequal without intervention from the government or from society. If you start with a bunch of people having very little capital and a bunch of people having a little bit more capital, over time, all things being equal, you would expect to see the people who started with just a little bit more end up with a lot more. And that's basically what we've seen over the like 250 or 300 years since the Industrial Revolution, is the people who had a little bit of capital ended up with a lot of capital. And this is the argument of Thomas Piketty's book, Capital, a few years ago, which is that rate of return to capital R is greater than the rate of growth G. And I recognize now that I'm using variables, I'm way deep into like masters in economics land. But I'll just stop there because I think understanding that the system that we are in, where the rich are getting richer, is a feature of how capital works, is really important to understanding whether and how we should do something about it.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that grounding. I think that talking about this kind of like feature within our economic system is really important because I think oftentimes when we get into this discussion about like rich people getting a lot richer, the conversation becomes kind of like moralized, of like, oh, well, is it like okay for us to like these people worked for their money? Should we like take their money away from them? Does that make sense? Oh, like good billionaires will like give some of their money away to charity, and that's really good. And I think that when you kind of like ground it in like what happens to wealth, if it grows over time, and what does that mean for a society, you start to recognize, like as you point out, the people who have money, it's just going to keep on going up. They're just going to have more and more, and that kind of brings me to this question of like, um, we should probably do something about it, but like why does it matter? And how do we go about kind of talking about that change? So my second question for you is like, all right, we recognize that things are unequal, but like truly, why does that matter? What impact does Elon Musk being a trillionaire have on my life, your life, and the lives of the people on this call?
Sure. I mean, there's a bunch of different ways to come at this question. I mean, one of them, which is the one that many people on the call have probably already heard, is that um, I think it's a really fair argument to say that it is impossible to accrue $1 trillion without extracting that from other people and exploiting other people. And that seems pretty clear. I think that is the case. But I think you don't even need to make that argument to argue that inequality is bad. So if we just take as a given that inequality exists, regardless of how it got there, and we just say, what does it look like when a society has some people who have literally trillions of dollars more than everyone else? Um, I think you can argue and should argue that that is a problem because democracy is premised on the idea that every citizen has an equal say, that every citizen has something to offer to the society, that every citizen has an equal voice in what should happen in how we live together. Obviously, that's never been the case, but that is the theory and the ideal that we're all working towards. And I think it's a good one to work towards. But because wealth is expressed in terms of money, and money is a way you can buy things that get you more things, the wealthy can and do exchange their money for more of a say than the rest of us. They do that in a million different ways. They do that by direct contributions to campaigns. They do that by investments in institutions that shape public discourse. They do that by buying media companies and bending them to their will. They do that by um, you know, funding academic institutions that can produce arguments that support their continued existence. There's a million different ways, a trillion different ways, you might say, that the wealthy can make their voice matter more than the rest of ours. And that disconnect, that fact that some voices matter more than others, is fundamentally corrosive to the underpinnings of democracy. And I think also corrosive to the idea that we live in a shared society. I think if everyone's sitting around, a campfire at night and there's like 15 of us and one person has, 400 plates of food and the rest of us don't have any, every single person would understand that the person who has a lot of food should share with the ones who don't. But that becomes harder to see when we're operating in a society of 350 million people, as we are in the United States, or nearly 7 billion people in the world. But I think the same moral intuition applies, which is that like either you are being unjust by holding on to all that money when others need it, or you aren't part of the same society. You don't have a social obligation to others. And I think because we all have strong intuitions that we are part of the same society as everyone else who's alive with us, we understand that hoarding all that wealth is fundamentally wrong.
Yeah, and I want to kind of like zero in on like what that wealth hoarding looks like. So we, people talk about like how does Elon Musk have all this money? So I want us to kind of get really pretty tangible with the idea of like wealth. When someone has like tons and tons of wealth, what does that like mean for them? And we'll jump onto this kind of like thread into our conversation about housing. But like when we talk about wealth, are we talking about just like, a bunch of money sitting in a bank somewhere? Or what does it mean to like own wealth? What does capital like really look like? And when one person has it, what does that do to the ability for other people to accrue wealth?
Yeah. Uh, I'm remembering a saying, and I forget who came up with it, which is something like, if you owe the bank $10,000, you have a problem. But if you owe the bank $100 million, the bank has a problem,
Hmm.
basically because like, you owe them a ton of money. And this is basically how being really rich works, is that like you have a bunch of assets, stuff. Usually, like if you're incredibly rich, it's because you own shares in some sort of company. There's other ways to get very rich, but most people who are extremely rich, that's how they get that way. And you go to the bank and you say, I need some money to like live my life, buy my yachts, buy my houses, like occasionally buy food, I guess. And they offer you a line of credit and that line of credit, which is a loan, is secured against the assets that you have because they're pretty confident that like if you ever need to pay them back, that you can pay them back with the stock you own. So you're not actually earning any normal income. You just have a bunch of assets and you have this line of credit from a bank that allows you to spend in the way you like. None of that looks like income, and so you're not really contributing as much in tax as the rest of us. This is certainly true in Washington. And your life looks really, really different than it does for a normal person who's trading their work for money, and is just trying to get by. It's a totally different financial existence. I don't know if that's what you were trying to get at, Jeff, but
Yeah.
that's
Yeah, and kind of thinking about like really that piece of it, like, wealth is not just like if you're like $1 million sitting in a bank account somewhere. It's like the wealth is like owning tangible parts of our society, right? It's
yeah,
owning the pieces of the company that make more money, right? It's owning like the
yeah,
railroads, right? It's owning housing, right? And that's something that we'll get into with our next question. So let's turn our attention towards housing, right? A lot of people who own lots and lots of wealth, they'll own like Elon Musk. Obviously, a lot of his wealth comes from owning SpaceX, right? It comes from owning Twitter, comes from owning Tesla, all these different companies. But most people who are very wealthy also have like broad kind of portfolios with a bunch of other shit that they own. Sorry. And one of those like big things that investors pour their money into is our increasingly, especially our housing in our country. And so let's turn our focus to housing. Housing is a basic need, but it's also a wealth building tool. And it has historically been one of the only ways that working people have been able to build some of their own wealth, right? We're all familiar with this. Folks have been able to like buy a house, 20, 30 years ago. Part of the reason why you're doing that is you're hoping it's going to build in value over time and you can build some personal wealth for yourself and start building that generational wealth. So yeah, one of the few things that like ordinary working people have had access to, though it's increasingly becoming out of reach. So I really want to kind of like ask you this question. I know you have some personal experience with this recently. What does it mean for our economy that one of our primary needs, housing, is also a wealth building tool? And how does that interact with this massive wealth inequality in our society?
yeah. Well, there's so many parts to this. Yeah, I'll start with like, what does it mean for our economy that one of our primary needs is also a wealth building tool? Um, which was part of your question. And the answer is, well, it's obviously not good. We're in a circumstance where you're basically in one of two categories. And as you mentioned, I went through this recently. Either you're trying to buy in to an escalator that at least for the last 30 years has kept going up. And so you want the price of getting on that escalator, the price of housing, to be as low as possible. Or you're already on the escalator and you want it to keep going up as fast as possible. So my personal example is I've been a renter my whole adult life until 2 weeks ago when my wife and I bought a house. And immediately I became interested in what the resale value of that house might be. I'm planning to live in it for 25 years, but Zillow sends me an email like every week that's like, here's what your house is worth now. Uh, and so immediately my interest went from having the cost of housing in the city be as low as possible to wanting the cost of my house in particular to go up. And like, I know my politics and I know my commitment, so I know I'm going to be able to sort of hold on to my commitment to trying to lower housing costs for everyone. But that's crazy that like my incentives would shift that much with this single purchase. And I think this tension is the central tension of housing policy that we have a whole set of housing policy that is basically using housing as a wealth generation tool or sort of an investment in college tool or retirement savings tool, whatever you want to use the wealth for. And so it's trying to push housing prices up for people who own homes. And then we have a whole part of housing policy that is trying to push housing prices down to let more people get involved. And underlying all of that is in most major American cities, including Seattle, a huge scarcity of housing because we've had for at least 50 years, arguably longer than that, policies which have artificially restricted the supply of housing, really just to maintain home values. And we are now seeing the consequences of that policy in home prices that are increasingly out of reach. And so, what is the way out of this tension? I think the way out is to recognize that we're trying to do too much with one single thing, which is a house. I think what people want out of a house is obviously a home to live in, but they want some price stability. Renters want this through rent control. Homeowners want this through a mortgage, which is basically rent control for homeowners. Um, they want location stability. They want to be able to like live where they want to live and know that they won't have to leave just because someone else told them to. Uh, and they want agency over their lives, basically. And then separately, they also want a secure retirement to be able to send their kids to higher education if that's what they and their kids want. They want all this other stuff that we've bundled into a house. Um, but this isn't going to work. Like it's already breaking down. Like it was able to work for a little while there was relatively abundant housing and housing prices were still going up over time. But we're reaching a breaking point where we can't achieve both of these goals at once. And so we need to find a way to break this cycle, both by building tons of housing, I think, but also by making wealth building possible and security possible without purchasing a home. And by ensuring that people have the ability to be stable in price and stable in location without it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a really interesting tension, and I think to kind of like the second part of my question, one thing I really think a lot about is like how much I don't know how many folks on this call were active in the political and economic world, or like me, were pretty young during the 2008 mortgage crisis. But seeing housing as this wealth building asset as like that has not gone unnoticed by these massive corporations and these massive, incredibly wealthy individuals and entities that are continuously seeing this mechanism within housing, which is that it is this entity in which you can buy a house and watch it increase in value over time, because that's what our housing system is meant to do. It's meant to make housing more expensive. And there's been this whole world in which all of these incredibly wealthy individuals and companies and investment firms have this incentive in acquiring these assets and then doing what they can to like increase them in value over time, right? And as we become a more and more, and then I see your hand, I'll just jump in here in just a sec. As we become a more and more unequal society, you put more and more purchasing power for greater amounts of our housing supply, especially if we continue to have a restricted housing supply, as Ryan's point out, into the hands of fewer and fewer people. And more people are increasingly unable to build the kind of wealth needed to buy into that system. And so you kind of get a larger and larger percentage of the population who are consistently going to be
Mm,
paying more and more of our income to the people who have been able to secure the wealth needed to acquire the assets and become landlords. So that we're paying our rent to them so they can get passive income and increase their wealth more and more. And more of us are going to be in that situation, and a smaller number of people are going to own a greater portion of our assets in our country. Something I've just been thinking a lot about.
yeah.
I want to let Ben jump on in here. Ben, what do you have to say? I feel like I'm on like a podcast and you're like a caller calling in on like a radio show.
Yeah,
What's
long
your,
time
what's your
listener,
take?
first time caller.
Yeah.
Um, so one of the big questions that I have here is when we're looking at wealth inequality, obviously having the world's first trillionaire is big, but simultaneously, even in a city where housing prices are as high as they are here, 40% of Seattle residents own their own homes. And so when we're looking at wealth inequality, to what extent is it a concern that we have, a trillionaire and obviously Gates lives across the lake, uh, versus when we look at the high number of homeowners, like what should we be considering? as kind of the bar of the concerning level of inequality, so that we can discuss the way that, like, as Ryan was discussing, the mere holding of an asset that increases in value changes the way that people's behavior and people's preferences reveal themselves,
Yeah.
and therefore kind of changes the calculus that 40% of our city, and I think 60% of Americans as a whole, um, use when they are looking at what economic policy they would support.
Yeah. I think you've articulated something really important, which is that although the question of wealth building through homeownership and the question of like, you know, exorbitant wealth like Elon Musk are related, they are pretty different policy problems, and like they have pretty different both causes and solutions. Um, so, we talked a lot about the trillionaire type wealth inequality, and there I think the answer is direct taxation of wealth, and a variety of other mechanisms to ensure that, like, as businesses grow, they don't have quite the same extractive features that they do now. Within the homeownership space, like, which is just a totally different level of wealth, like it's a lot of money, but it's nowhere close to $1 trillion. Um, I think it's important to think about, like, why would a normal person want to build wealth? And the answer is basically defensive. It's security. Like, a lot of stuff goes wrong in life. You get sick, you have expenses, you get old, you need money to make sure you don't die or live horribly. And so people are scrambling to build wealth however they can because they view it as basically insurance against things going wrong. And so I think that is an important thing to keep in mind because it points towards what we should be working towards, which is not wealth building as a goal in and of itself, but security and agency as the goal that people are trying to achieve through wealth building. And so, can we try to find ways to build security and agency for as many people as possible while still, allowing homes to be homes and not investment vehicles and not things that are building security? And I think that's why I've sort of made my career move from housing and homelessness world into tax and budget world, because I see this connection as being really important. If we are able to decommodify the important, like, and expensive parts of life, long-term care, childcare, healthcare, all those things, so that people don't feel like there's such a risk that their lives will totally fall apart financially, if they don't have huge wealth, then I think we're in a position where, if your home value goes down a little bit or even just doesn't go up as much as you thought it might, it's not such a big deal because if you get sick, you'll be okay. If you need to retire, you'll be okay. Like, that's not the world we live in right now. And so a lot of people view, like, buying a home and having that home's value go up is the only way to be safe. But I think we need to recognize that the goal isn't wealth building for its own sake, it's security and agency. That's what we're working
Yeah.
towards. Jeff,
Yeah,
can I respond to
absolutely.
your earlier point about
Yeah.
institutional investors?
Oh, please.
This is sort of going back one conversation. Um, I actually am much less convinced by the argument that institutional investors are a big problem in our housing market than a lot of my friends on the left are. Um, Institutional investors own only about 3 or 4% of single family homes in this country, so 95 or 96% are owned by normal people or by sort of very small level landlords. The number's a little bit higher for multifamily housing, but it's still they only between 10 and 15%. So, 85 to 90% are not owned by institutional investors. If you have a ton of money, there are many better ways to make a ton of money than owning real estate. Like, you will buy shares in a company or you'll buy shares in something else. Like, real estate is good for normal people because, one, you can live in it, and two, a bank will give you a loan, a 30-year mortgage to buy it. But if you're an institutional investor, it's not the main way they're making a ton of money. And it's not even the main reason that housing costs are going up. The main reason housing costs are going up is NIMBYs, is like your neighbors putting in place zoning laws that restrict the supply of housing, which means that housing costs go up. I'm not saying that institutional investors buying housing is a good thing. I'm just saying that it's a relatively small thing and it's not the main thing that's driving housing costs. The main thing that's driving housing costs is the lack of supply. And the main reason for that is like your neighbor who owned their house 25 years ago.
Yeah, I think the interesting in the conversation of wealth inequality is thinking about what I think that when I think about wealth inequality, I think housing to me is a really good example. Because while like the number proportion to all of housing is like low, maybe you know like that 10-15% institutional investors in our multifamily housing seems kind of low. If you look at like the growth in institutional investment in multifamily housing over time, it's grown. And as we look towards an increasingly unequal society, a society in which more and more wealth is concentrated, kind of to your very original point, you've got this world in which people who have vast amounts of wealth, what they need to do is they need to use that wealth to accumulate more wealth. That's kind of what they're like incentivized to do. If you give me $1 million, you know, my reality with that, or if you give me like $500,000, $1 million kind of a lot. Give me $500,000. My activity with that $500,000 is going to be very different than if you give someone who already has, you know, $50 million.
Totally.
They're going to take that $500,000 and they are going to buy up assets, right? They are going to buy more and more of the assets that make a productive economy, and they are looking at the kind of full buffet of options that are available to them. And the housing sector is one, and it has proven to be profitable in some regards. And more people are opting into the passive income that comes from owning rental housing. And so more and more of and this is like, you know, seen in the decline, also the decline in like home ownership of young people over time. So to me, it just gets back to this like broader concern of increasing wealth inequality and how that wealth inequality like relates to our ability to kind of like get what we need. To your point, the things that give us security. And Ben, I want to bring you in here, and then I want to jump kind of to like a what is to be done question.
So then my question, when we're looking at institutional investors being about, say 5% of the market, just to be lazy, um, we're looking at a vacancy rate of around 5%, just to have enough places, since I'm in the market for a new apartment. I love that there are vacancies. And so the question is, when we're looking at the social housing developer, um, if 5% is enough to create kind of the market swings that we're suggesting, is our belief that having 5% of housing units in the hands of the social housing developer, or another method of having kind of democratic control over prices that's more related to wages rather than asset growth, enough to actually um, change the entire market condition?
Mm.
Or is I and if 5% is enough to do that, that's really cool. But my question is kind of, I always imagine that social housing is kind of the way that I feel, as a person that doesn't own my own car, about transportation prices, where the bus and the train are really great until they start running. And then when I'm, out past 2 a.m. In Beacon Hill, it's going to be really expensive to get home because I have to rely on the private market, and only the private market exists at that time with, Uber. Um, do we believe that 5% is actually enough to upset the market that heavily? Um, Especially when we're looking at a full change in ownership, rather than 5% just being these institutional investors that are the same general market forces on steroids.
Yeah, really good question. 5% ownership of the market, housing market by the social housing developer would be pretty significant. So to put that in context, right now, all types of like non-market housing, so like nonprofit housing, community land trust, all these kinds of like non-market housing solutions make up like maybe about 5% of Seattle's housing stock. So the vast majority of Seattle's housing stock is like private rentals or private home ownership, right? As Ryan alluded to. 5% is social housing would be significant. What we're hoping for is to kind of go beyond that. I'll say my personal hope is to get closer to, what Paris has been able to accomplish, which is somewhere around, 25% of the city is sitting in that social housing range. That starts to really, really impact the game and starts to affect pricing of the private market. Though I do think that 5% would still be significant and would start to sway the conversation. You're right that it creates that competition of the public market with the private market, where the private market has to kind of contend with the fact that the public sector is here and it is delivering service that is based on cost, and it can deliver it cheaper because it's not seeking a profit. It's just functionally based off cost and like wages. So I think that's like a really important part of this. And I'm going to jump off of your question and jump into this broader question of like what is to be done. So we can talk about social housing, right? Obviously, we're super huge fans of social housing here, but like how is social housing part of this solution? And what other solutions exist when we're talking about, you know, distributing wealth away from the super wealthy and using it to improve the lives of working people?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's what I started saying a couple answers ago, which is I think what we're basically aiming for is giving people as much security and agency as possible. And that means like giving them options outside of the market for the really big things in life: housing, healthcare, childcare, long-term care, as you're aging. Social housing is so important because it takes housing out of the market, and it allows housing to be homes, and that's something that is tied up in people's, retirement security and sort of future investment opportunities. We still need to give them an opportunity to have retirement security and pay for their kids' college and all those things, which is why we need to do the work that we're doing at EOI to try to build a real safety net in all these places. Because if you take away one tool to do that, which is home ownership, you need to make sure that there are other tools. But we can't wait for one or the other. We need to sort of move forward on both fronts to like build a real robust social safety net and also build tons more social housing to allow housing to be primarily a home. I'll also just add, yeah, Jeff, I'd like your answer to Ben's most recent question. The percentage is important, but the size of the pie is really important too. Like, I want the overall housing supply in the city to be, double in the next 20 years. And I'd love social housing to be a large percentage of that. And I think the most important thing is overall supply going up. Yeah, college too. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm a little cheeky in the chat for folks who didn't see. When we're talking about solutions here, I think one thing that I think is one of the reasons why I love social housing so much, and will be working on it probably for the rest of my life, is that social housing, especially with the way that we've done it here in Seattle, I think that I just want to hype us up again. We did really cool stuff with these two campaigns. We created this amazing government institution, this public institution that is publicly overseen and run, that is able to funnel wealth away from the wealthiest people in our city, and use that and hold on to that as a public good and a public asset. And it's then able to use that wealth that it's building up. The social housing developer is now building wealth by pulling it away from wealthiest corporations that are using that money to create AI guidance systems that are bombing kids in other countries. It's able to pull that away and put it into these assets that it is building up, this wealth that it is building up for the people of Seattle, the public sector of Seattle. And it is using that wealth to then reduce costs. And so I think this is like this really, really important piece. This is why I wanted to have Ryan on, because EOI is doing such incredible work in this regard of figuring out how do we, the story of wealth inequality in this country is actually not just a story of wealth being ripped away from the working class and given to the 1%, which is very much what's happening through like lower stagnating wages, higher costs, all these different things. We are seeing the working class is losing its share of the nation's wealth, and that's going up. But another huge place where we've lost wealth is the government has lost a ton of wealth. The government used to be a very wealthy, wealth holding entity. Now, that was back in the era when we actually taxed the rich, right? Before Reagan, before like Margaret Thatcher's of the world came in and decided we were going to slash taxes on the rich, and instead we were going to borrow from them. And that's what the government does now, borrows money from rich people and pays them interest. So they get even richer. So the overall, I can't remember the exact number, but the overall number is like the government used to have like, wealth that accounts for like 40% of the nation's GDP. And now we have like negative wealth. Like, when we talk about the US being like trillions and trillions of dollars in debt, that's kind of like part of what we're talking about. The government has given up its ability to build its own wealth. And instead, it is borrowing or paying programs that are privatizing public sectors to give public money to more rich people. And so what social housing does is it interrupts that and says, no, no, we are going to bring that wealth back into public hands and we're going to use it to reduce costs for working people. And I think the more we can do that, the more we'll start to see that we kind of rebalance towards a more equal society. So social housing is a huge part of that. The paid family leave that you're talking about, Ryan, is a huge part of that. Free childcare would be enormous, a huge, huge part of that. College, healthcare, the things that people are saving for, if those were instead like paid for by the government because it has this wealth that it can use to deliver those services, that is when we start talking about meaningfully tackling wealth inequality and starting to deliver for working people. So yeah, hyping up the work that you're doing, Ryan. Ryan, do you want to take a second and share a little bit about some of the work that EOI is up to for some of those other solutions, and then we can pop on into questions?
Sure. I really appreciate those kind words. And I mean, right back at you. As Our Neighbors has done more to transform Seattle than any other group in the last 10 years, I would say. And that'll become more and more obvious over time, I think. Um, we, as I mentioned, work in three major spaces. We work in tax and budget, where this past year we fought for and won the millionaires tax, along with many other groups, including How's Our Neighbors, um, and where we're fundamentally fighting for an economy that works for everyone. Washington has the second most progressive tax code in the country, behind only Florida, which means that the poorest 20% in our state are paying far more of their income in taxes than the richest 20% or the richest 1%. So we're trying to change that. I know. Thank you. We're finally behind someone else. Thank you, Capital Gains. Um, we work in healthcare, where we lead the Fair Health Prices Coalition, trying to bring healthcare costs down and put people over profit in healthcare. And then, as I mentioned, we're pretty deep in both paid leave and in childcare, trying to defend the paid family medical leave program that's been one of the most popular things the state has ever done, starting in 2019, allowing folks to be there for themselves and for loved ones when they need care. And then childcare, we're still trying to make sure that the state funds its existing commitments to childcare, but we also need to go further than that and lower childcare costs because they are ridiculous right now.
So much good work. So many places to keep pushing. Really, really appreciate you being here. Really appreciate you doing that work. We've got 10 more minutes. A couple of folks have been popping in off in the chat. Ben's asked a few questions. I just want to really open this up for our last 10 minutes. Really appreciate the folks who've been here. You could have been watching the France-Spain game, but instead you came to talk about tax policy and wealth building. Now's the time. If you have any questions or if you just have kind of like something that you're thinking about in this conversation, if this relates to some other work that you're doing, I'd love to invite you in and kind of chat a little bit here at the end.
Hi, this is Amalia Margaret. It's an honor to be here, and I'm glad to understand quite a bit more than I did before and have some different language for this. I was wondering if you guys can provide the links for the websites of the organization so we can be sure and just keep educating ourselves and support initiatives and uh, spread the word that way.
Ryan, you want to drop y'all's website in the chat?
Yep, I'll do that. I'll also drop the Urbanists website, which I'm still on the board of. So there's EOI, and then the Urbanist, which I used to run, is there. Thanks for the compliment, Rosie
Yeah, thanks
and
so much.
Amalia.
And then, as long as no one else is piping in for just a moment, Amelie again, just wondering, I just keep thinking about tax rebates on interest paid to mortgage. Is there anybody working on that to make, right now we don't pay federal income tax on the interest that we pay on our home mortgage, but people who rent don't get that same benefit. Is there anybody working on that? I've been asking round and about. It sounds like a big problem, hard
I
problem.
agree. It's a huge problem. It's crazy. Um, I don't know who's working on that nationally. I sort of assume for a lot of stuff that will require national changes, that it's not going to happen for the foreseeable future, just because, the federal government is a complete disaster. But yeah, it's crazy. It's also crazy that like, paying rent on time every month doesn't do anything to build your credit. Uh, that is like the biggest check most people are writing every single month, and they're paying it on time, and they get nothing from it financially, except the right to live in that place for another month. So I wish I had an answer to your question, but I don't, and I agree it's a big problem. Yeah, correct. Credit scores are a tool for the bank, not a tool for you. Yes.
Plugging a public bank. Another great way to build wealth for the public is if we had our own bank, like they do in North Dakota, South Dakota. I always mix it up. North Dakota?
That's North Dakota.
Yeah.
Thank you for the plug for Washingtonians for Public Banking, Jeff. Uh,
Yeah.
I'll hop in with another question. So if we were to lower the cost of housing, obviously right now we are working towards more progressive revenue, but a lot of our city budget is based around things like property taxes. And I'm sure somebody else can quote the exact number that our city budget makes from that. But if we lower the cost of housing and move things out of like dollar denominated land flow, what's that going to do to the way that city taxes are going to function? And I know
Mhm.
obviously we want to bring things in a way that like one city taxes can go further because they're not having to pay exorbitant amount of prices for every parcel of land that the city needs to do more social housing or build another building to deliver whatever service. Um, but how do we see kind of that transition going? And do we protect our tax income as we're sliding into a system that allows for us to go further with our tax dollars?
Yeah. As crazy as this is to say, I think that our odds of comprehensive tax reform are way better than our odds of changing the entire housing economy. And EOI is working on changing our entire tax system. And I'm hoping that there'll be significant progress on that over the next 5 to 7 years. And even if we were really successful in sort of driving costs down, by doing all the right things, I think it would take a number of years to work its way through the market. And so my basic answer to your question is like do the tax stuff right away, and it'll be in place before we have to deal with the consequences you're talking about. Like we do need to fundamentally change how cities and counties are funded, and as hard of a lift as that is, it's going to be easier and faster than making the kind of changes we're talking about to the housing market.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love this question because it assumes a world in which we have decommodified enough of the housing stock that we're
Correct.
like
Yeah.
really impacting the property tax collection. And I'm like, if we're there, oh man, amazing problem to have.
Yeah.
But a real problem nonetheless, because property tax is a huge portion of how we fund our public schools and these other entities. And the social housing developer did just get official notice from the King County Assessor a few months ago that we are property tax exempt, which means that we can deliver much cheaper rents, which is really important. But yeah, it is something to kind of like grapple with. I personally, just like kind of fall into this position where I'm like, so much of our tax collection is going into the kinds of programs that like the social housing developer is able to deliver, the kind of affordability that's able to deliver. So like just kind of like reshifting our priority of what's happening with our taxes is also part of the problem. But I think Ryan's like absolutely on the money. We have to figure out how to like change where we're getting our taxes from, so that this becomes less and less a concern over time. All right, we've got time for maybe one more heavy hitter question, like how do we reform our entire property tax system? Who else wants to jump in with something that meaty and juicy? I'm just kidding. It could be any other comment.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Hey. This is Afreesha. I will just say real quick, number one, thank you all for hosting this. This is super helpful. And I know a lot of people are probably also going through similar stuff or have been through similar stuff like me, especially with this eviction. I'm very grateful for the social housing. I saw that we had 10,000 people apply for one of the Alara with the lottery recently, and obviously they couldn't house everybody at once, so it greatly highlights the need either to quickly acquire either vacant units that can be acquired at whatever is their cost under social housing and it come under their ownership, or just that we build that either we build a housing or we just acquire properties like they've been doing. So that's really great, and I just wanted to share that I will also share the resources that I said that I would share with all of Puget Sound, tenants union, house our neighbors. I will share those in the email with you all, as I had mentioned, because I know that this is affecting a lot of people, even me. I woke up this morning knowing I was going to come to this meeting, and right about 30 to 45 minutes before I hopped on, my landlord literally just told me right now that I'm evicted. So, yeah, so I will send those over, and I hope I will be able to join maybe some of you later on tonight. But if not, I will definitely get those resources sent over so that people understand how to navigate the legal framework of how to deal with these, evictions and the housing crisis and all that stuff. So, thank you.
Yeah, and thank you so much. I hope that folks reaching out were able to help kind of support and give you some direction. It's amazing that you still came here, and thank you so much for wanting to share resources that will help others in your situation, but also like take care of you and reach out to us, and if we can help with offering more services, I didn't want it to derail us too much from our program here, but I'm going to reach out after. Hopefully, we've got your contact information and we can try our best to make sure that whatever support is available from this community can be kind of at your disposal.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, y'all. Well, it is 12:59 and the Spain and France or whatever game is potentially still on. So I really appreciate everyone coming through. Thank you so much for these conversations. Oh, one Spain. Oh, France gets knocked out. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Let's keep on having these conversations. Again, massive, massive thank you to Ryan for coming and sharing your insight and all of the experience that you have working in these systems. Thank you again for all of your work. We're very grateful to have you as a partner as we try to build an economy that works for everyone so that Seattle can be a place where everyone can afford to live and thrive and have the security that we're all looking for.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. All right. Appreciate you all. Take care.